Okay, welcome everybody. Thank you so much for joining us for today's event. My name is Rahel KJ David. I'm the Leadership Development Facilitator at the Dais. First of all, thank you for coming here. You know, since the sun is already down and it's dark outside, we're so happy to have you. We had a really good response to those who registered online and those that are here in person. So I have a little script. I'm going to go through it so I don't forget anything. So for those of you who don't know, the Dais, we are a think tank that's based at the Toronto Metropolitan University. Our name means raised platform, and it's pronounced Day, D-A-Y-E-S-E-S, Dais. All right. So what is the Dais? The Dais is a place that illuminates the people that are on it. It reminds us that real change can only happen when we lift new voices and ideas. Our mission is to connect people to the ideas and powers that we need to build a more inclusive, innovative, and prosperous Canada. From our home base at TMU, our team is dedicated to advancing an inclusive and innovative economy and democracy in Canada across three pillars. One, innovation and technology. Two, education and skills. And three, democracy and trust. Before we begin today's event, I would like to give the land acknowledgement. We do this as a symbolic restorative act, one amongst many to follow, and a part of a wider and hopefully transformative reconciliation project here at TMU. Those joining us in person are gathered at the TMU campus, which is located in, and I hope I'm pronouncing this right, Toronto, a Mohawk word that describes the place in the water where the trees are standing. TMU is on the territory of the Anishinaabe, the Haudenosaunee, and the Huron-Wendat. It is covered by the Dish with One Spoon Treaty, Treaty 13, and the Williams Treaties. We are committed to honoring our obligations to these nations, treaties, and to justice for Indigenous peoples generally. We also acknowledge and pay tribute to those of us who came here involuntarily, particularly as a result of the transatlantic slave trade. We honor and pay tribute to the ancestors of African origin and descent who also continue to live in the impacts of colonization in solidarity with Indigenous peoples. We also like to thank the Canadian Race Relations Foundation, which is sponsoring this series. So this anti-racism series is designed by our staff team, many whom you've met coming in. And for this session in particular, we are keen to have a timely and crucial conversation about pressing issues of environmental racism towards the Indigenous communities. Before we start the panel, we would like to begin with some housekeeping reminders. One, engaging with questions. For those that are online, please know that you have access to the Q&A function on the webinar. Please feel free to submit your questions anytime during, before the break and during this session. And those that are in person, just to my right, your left, Kamara's holding up a bin and some paper. Please feel free to take a notepad and pen and submit your question into that bin, and we will make sure that our moderator gets them so they can pose it to the speakers online. So we're open to answering as many questions as possible, but we may not get an opportunity to answer all of them. And during our 5-minute break, we will collect those questions that are submitted and share them with our online moderator. So about our online moderator, I'm delighted to introduce the moderator for today's panel, Samantha White-Eye. Samantha White-Eye is the Indigenous Leadership Director at Carolinian Canada. The organization works collaboratively to promote the health of ecosystems in the Carolinian Zone, the most diverse and delicate ecoregion in Canada, spanning from Toronto to Windsor. Samantha is a community leader from Ellapalikawi. She is very passionate and dedicated to her work within Southern Ontario and the Indigenous communities she actively serves. Samantha comes from grassroots immersed experiences which she utilizes her lived experience and understandings to create space, advocate, and lead conversations centering on truth and reconciliation. Leading with an ethical, two-eyed seeing approach, Samantha demonstrates leadership as a change maker in the environmental sector. Samantha is very knowledgeable and connected to her Lenape culture as she continuously weaves the medicine and teachings into her work and daily lifestyle. She is also passionate about ancestral seed sovereignty and hopes it helps build bridges back to identity for the people. Over the past year, Samantha has worked closely with Carolinian Canada Coalition and continues her work in a new role as Indigenous Leadership Director to help shift the narratives in conversation. Everyone, let's welcome Samantha.
Thank you so much, Rahel, for that lovely introduction. And I will be moderating the panel here that we've put on by Dais. And I'd like to actually introduce the speakers today. So if you please join me in a warm welcome, we have Jana Whale, is from Gittimax First Nation on her dad's side, and is also Cree Métis on her mother's side. She holds a Bachelor's of Natural Resources and a Master's in Sustainability, where her research focused on climate resilience in Indigenous communities. Jana currently works as a policy advisor at the Canadian Climate Institute. Next, we have Skawa Kwush, who is present in many spaces working as the Indigenous Climate and Policy Advisor. Jana, would you first like to introduce yourself in a way that you feel comfortable, and then we will pass it on.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you, Sam. Stingigat Sigadam Hanak Gank Gabalwilsa, Ama Silkswa, Jana Whale Wae, Gitsan, Iginimax Nii. Tonse, Jana, Dishnikashon, Snanemok, Niwikin, Mr. High, Spiritwood, Meadow Lake, Monfami, Shinakashu, Charette, and Arkand. So my name's Jana Whale. I'm from Gittimax First Nation on my dad's side, and I'm also Cree Métis and Mixed European on my mother's side. My parents are Cliff Whale and Laurel Tier, and my grandparents are Vivian Charette, Raymond Tier, and Judy Marshall and Victor Whale. My family is from Gittimax First Nation on my dad's side, and my Métis last names are Charette and Arkand from near Spiritwood and Meadow Lake. I'm calling in today from the traditional territory of Nunavut people on Vancouver Island in BC, which is now known as Nanaimo. Thank you.
Thank you.
I can jump in here. Yadek Shish, Tansquash, Squackwash, Lily, and Dunstan Moore. Good evening. My name is Squackwash, which translates to sunshine. I am a Nicola'am, Statliam, Yakima, and Irish youth from Cumsheen, also known as Lytton in British Columbia. But I'm calling in from the traditional territories of the Anishinaabe and Algonquin peoples, also known as Ottawa. I'm the Indigenous Climate and Policy Advisor with a nonprofit called Videa. Currently a member of the ECCC Youth Council and just handed over my chair duties as well. So I was the chair for the first year. I'm currently on the youth advisory group with CC UNESCO, where I'm working on the working group for the UN, for the International UN Decade of Indigenous Languages. And I'm in Ottawa to do a parliamentary internship for the environment with Environment Leadership Canada and GreenPAC, where I am currently working within the Senate on environmental legislation. Thank you. I feel like we lost our moderator.
Oh dear. No, moderator. How will be a moderator?
Oh, he's back. Is that me?
That's you, yes. I think you'll have to moderate now.
Oh, yay me. Okay. Let me get my notes. Hold on. This is what I was telling you.
Now she's back.
Is she back? Great. Okay. Hey, Sam.
Sorry, folks.
Okay, no worries.
Okay. Thank you so much for those beautiful introductions. I really appreciated hearing the language. It's definitely different dialects that I don't get to hear every day. So Anishik for that. So I'd like to dive into the questions right now. We have a lot of good questions lined up for you folks. And so I will just start. For those who don't know, how prevalent is the issue of environmental racism and Indigenous communities in Canada for Indigenous communities in Canada? And can you share some recent statistics or research that exemplify the severity of the issue? Jana, if you would, oh, sorry, whoever would like to start first.
Do you want to start or should I?
You're free to go.
Sounds good. First, I wanted to open by saying that the views that I'm going to be talking about are really my own, and they're not reflective of my family, my nation, or even my place of work. But the way that I understand environmental racism is really, it's a form of racism that leads to environmental hazards and risks being placed near Indigenous communities disproportionately. So environmental racism really continues to be foundational to the relationship that Indigenous communities hold with Western governments, which actually continues to impact Indigenous communities today. In my line of work and what I do, climate change is really beginning to impact Indigenous communities, as it has for generations. But yeah, I think environmental racism has really contributed to how we're experiencing those impacts. Partly because of the legacy of colonialism in Canada and environmental racism as well. Indigenous communities typically have a longer way to go in terms of being able to really prepare and respond to climate change. Entrenched environmental policies that have contributed to these disproportionate impacts continue to really affect community outcomes in really tangible ways. So a lot of communities that I know, this actually translates into things like physical displacement. For example, in BC, Whispering Pines Indian Band Reserve is located about 100 kilometers away from where they traditionally lived. Similar, there's also Simpcw First Nation, which was relocated about 4 hours away from their home territory. Or this displacement could also mean kind of how communities were able to live traditionally and connect to their seasonal roundup cycles. So as we see different policies come into place when settlers arrived, these connections were essentially broken, which has now placed Indigenous communities at a higher risk for experiencing climate impacts. So under the imposed reserve system, the introduction to Crown land, communities were essentially forced onto fractions of land where they once did not maybe have relationships with and were therefore hindered in their ability to practice seasonality or access resources in the same way. So after being subjected to this kind of new system of living, or the nuclear housing model that is now practiced on reserve, it basically means that Indian Act has really taken away communities' ability to respond adequately to climate change. And I think that's something that we're not really talking about, or I haven't heard a whole lot of in climate spaces, but essentially the reduced access to territories is really impacting community health outcomes and how we're able to access healthcare, and is putting us at risk for a lot of different environmental impacts that are being caused by climate change. I think I'll leave it there for right now.
Thank you so much.
I can jump in here now. Thank you. I really want to pick apart this question because I don't entirely, I guess, agree with how it was written out. I guess first starting with some statistics and research. Environmental racism isn't fully something you can quantify. I think there are a handful of different factors here, but the one I really want to focus on is how we see and view Indigenous communities. Because I know the question specifically states, again, this is me picking it apart, Canada, as an Indigenous person, I have a real issue with colonial borders. I understand wanting to have the data for the country that we live in, but we also have to understand that Canada has a huge hand in extraction, whether that's physically or financially, within other Indigenous communities outside of so-called Canada. Think of Norway, Ecuador, Colombia, even the US. Their lands are being heavily affected by Canada's involvement in extraction, which in hand also is environmental racism in many different ways, some that Janet even had just mentioned. And I don't think that is a conversation that we've even started to have yet, because it starts to deconstruct colonial constructs. And that isn't a conversation that a lot of people, specifically within states, want to have. And it opens up I said conversation plenty of times, but it opens up the conversation of colonial borders, jurisdiction, policies, and specifically bureaucracy plays a huge hand in that. And it makes it more complex in a way. But if we're going to be talking about environmental racism and how Indigenous communities are affected, we can't just be looking within so-called Canada. We have to be really looking at the broader picture, and that is including all Indigenous communities, because Indigenous people don't work within a colonial border, and I don't think that we should try to quantify statistics or research within just one state as well.
Thank you so much for that. And I think that's largely another, like you said, another issue that's not being addressed when we look at the impacts and those colonial forces enacting environmental racism. Thank you both for that. I'm going to move on to question 3. At the DS, they are a public policy and leadership think tank and are always interested in what the government priorities and laws that need to change in order to resolve the root cause of an issue. What public policy changes do you think need to be made to address the issue of environmental racism towards Indigenous communities? And Skawa K. Wash, can we start with you, please?
Yeah. I just have to read the question over again. I'm so sorry. It is a late night for me. I think that's a really tough one, because if we are going to really address the core issue of environmental racism, we also have to address the core issue of what is racism, and that's colonialism. And it's bringing up a history that Canada and other colonizer countries are not fully ready to even look at or speak truth to yet. And when it comes to like writing policy or even thinking about policy, can we fully have good sustainable policy if we're not ready to address the real issue in the room? And we are a colonial state. We work with other colonial states as well. And it's the government, and this is coming from someone who also is currently working in the government, it's not ready to move into a place where we can fully address, or not address, to fully create sustainable change. And that's really hard for me to say, but speaking the truth, that if we want to move in a direction that is a safe place, a safe country for not just Indigenous people, for all, but all BIPOC youth, not youth, all BIPOC people, and just everyone in general, it's having to uncover, I'm so sorry. It is a very long day for me. I've been on Zoom since like noon. It's having to uncover generations of trauma, and not just Indigenous trauma either. There are multiple traumas having to be uncovered, and that's a scary thing. And that takes not just a lot of courage, but it'll take a lot of vulnerability. And we live in a patriarchal society. Patriarchy doesn't like vulnerability. And I think there's a multitude of levels that really need to, I guess, power through. I want to make a Barbie reference, but I can't think of one right now.
Thank you so much for that. I'm going to pass it to Jana.
Yeah, thank you for that. And I think just to echo some of, Sunshine's comments, like it's really hard to talk about these really big questions when I think we're really still starting from an unequal place. Like if you look at the relationship that Indigenous communities have with settler governments, I think we've come a long way. But I think when we look at representation at decision-making tables, when we look at, where community funding is coming from and how much is being distributed amongst communities, and you look at the, proportion of pipelines that are being built on and through and next to Indigenous territories compared to, other small rural communities, I think we're still starting for a very unequal place in kind of deconstructing the power narrative that have really, contributed to where we find ourselves today with all of these unequal impacts that are, really entrenched in the system that we have. I think some of the things that I can think about in starting to answer this question that again are very piecemeal and are not definitely going to take us where we need to go, but are a step in the right direction is maybe having more Indigenous people at decision-making tables. I think, the more people we can put in power that have the knowledge, have the experience, and are able to help deconstruct those narratives, we're going to be further along and we're going to create better, more holistic decisions when we're talking about, environmental decisions and understanding the larger context of the world that we're operating within and having more diversity of voices at the table. And I think the second thing is really our education system needs to change. I think the average Canadian probably really doesn't understand the nuance of like how, the Indian Act works and how, the reserve system is really impacting our ability to access resources, or what it means when we talk about, self-determination and sovereignty and these different things. I think we're getting there, but not understanding these things is really both creating a lot of fear, from my understanding, with people that don't understand. They're afraid to ask and they don't want to have these conversations where they feel like they're not allowed to ask. And also is just creating a lot of more, we could be further along if we just kind of came to these places together and really opened it up as a safe space. So I think in order to really start addressing environmental racism, it really is a little bit about how settlers are able to kind of work in this space and carry the load of education. I think that'll free up a lot of time for, Indigenous people to kind of really drive solutions. But I also think it'll make everybody feel a little bit more a part of, creating that change as well. And again, those are just small things, but I think it's a big question, and I think those are maybe good places to start.
Thank you for that. I actually resonate a lot with your first point, Janet, only because I work in the conservation sector and I see how slow they are to adopt Indigenous leadership, adopt new ways of thinking and working with traditional ecological knowledge on the land and what that means. And the government is even slower. So I see that firsthand. Thank you. We have a few more minutes to answer probably one more question, about 3 minutes each. So I'm going to ask the last question here. So are there any examples of promising policy solutions from other provinces, territories, countries, or Indigenous self-governments that you have seen work that could do well here?
I can jump in first. I don't know specifically on provinces and territories, but currently federally is Bill C-226, which is on a national strategy to address environmental racism. And it's currently in the Senate going to committee. I'm so sorry, this is very much the federal part of me talking. But actually, I take that back. I do not apologize. I think this national strategy has a huge chance to really not only address environmental racism, but come up with real solutions that can be used for amendments in bills that has been spoken about, but also to be implemented into future environmental bills. And it could put a real lens on environmental racism in, my thoughts are going so fast. It could put like an environmental racism lens that could be implemented into these bills. I'm pretty sure I already said that. I think that's 3 minutes. Jana, I will pass it to you.
Yeah, thanks. In terms of like specifics, I think one of the things that I was thinking about when I first read this question was really the development and the expansion of, things like guardians networks. I think that's really important to really serve to, reestablish connections with territory and allow, intergenerational teaching to take place and get our community members back on the land using federal and provincial dollars. I think that's amazing. I also think that it's really helping to shift this victimhood narrative that I hear a lot of in the climate space, where we're almost not being blamed for being impacted disproportionately. I hear a lot of things like, well, if we had more capacity, or if our community wasn't in that spot, we know it gets flooded every year. Why are you guys still there? I think it's really forcing people in positions of power to reconsider Indigenous people as leaders, as scientists, as engineers, as stewards of these lands in a way that, I don't think the conversation in the past was really framed in that way. I think it's super positive to begin to see those changes in language, and I think that, over time that will help to deconstruct the victimhood narrative that has really done a disservice to our communities who are in, federal documents being referenced as leaders fighting the climate crisis, but not being treated as such. And also starting to address the environmental racism by having our community members out on the land, able to report and have their word taken seriously about things that are happening in our territories. Yeah, that's my answer.
I would agree a lot with what you said too, because I find too, even in this sector, when we come up with solutions from a traditional ecological knowledge, that point of view, that area, we're often invalidated. Our knowledges of the landscape are often invalidated, and to push back, and then Western sides might catch up, and then they're like, oh, it's too late though, So I definitely agree with a lot of, what you both said, especially about the Guardians Network. I think they're fantastic programs. I've seen them in action, in success work, especially in bridging that gap between, Indigenous youth and the capacity barrier and that we're facing right now for Indigenous leadership in the sector. So thank you both for bringing those very valid points up. So I believe we are going to go on a break right now. And then when we come back, if audience folks have some Q&A to put in, please put it into the chat now. We were going to be looking at that when we come back from the break. We will return sharply at 6:35. So put your questions in now. We're going to look at those when we get back, and have the panelists answer them. So thank you, everyone. We will be back at 6:35 sharp. Anishik.
First of all, fuck.
Okay, folks, welcome back. 6:35, here we are. I want to open it up to the audience Q&A. I've taken a peek here at the questions. I'm just going to wait for our speakers here to get the okay from them. Okay, yes, and oh, okay. And I'm still waiting for, okay, yes, there we go. Thank you. Thank you both. Okay. So, I'm gonna I'm gonna ask some questions here. So I have a couple of really good ones that I think are great. So I'm gonna ask this question, and they use an example. So, um, okay. So this speaker or this question asks, they said that there was a big issue for Indigenous people, that they felt a discrimination and not that they weren't being heard properly. And the example that they gave was the conservation of caribou. They asked, do you feel there are still issues of not being heard by the government when dealing with the destruction of environment and wildlife on Indigenous lands? Whoever would like to answer first.
I can start. I think, yeah, like in my experience, I've started working now. I have a master's and it took a couple years to get that, but I have, provincial government experience. I was an IUP intern, and even during my time in the government, we heard from a lot of communities that people would be bringing up these concerns and the government wouldn't really do anything about it. Like they would hear you and they would listen and say, thank you for your time. Thank you for coming to tell us about this issue. There was lots of opportunities that I got to sit in on with different communities, speaking, directly with the minister or my senior executives, and having a lot of good conversation. But, after that, I didn't really hear a whole lot about what happened next. Environmental racism, from my understanding, has been talked about for years before we've been having this conversation. Like, I think communities are really getting fed up with the amount of times it takes for the government to really, act on a lot of these concerns that we're bringing up. In my community specifically, we've been talking about salmon for years. We're a fishing nation, so one of the ways that I am able to really connect with my Gitxsan identity is going back to our community every year to traditionally fish and harvest with my family and my community. And every year we've noticed that there's fewer and fewer salmon returning. And every year our communities come to the government, come to these engagements and say, hey, what are we going to do? We're losing out on all this protein. We're losing out on these connections to culture. We're really afraid for the future. We're afraid for our youth. And there hasn't been a lot of action. There hasn't been a lot of, things happening that I can tangibly see, especially as somebody working in these spaces. Not a lot has been done, and I think that's really disappointing from my understanding anyway. I can pass it to you, Sunshine.
Thank you. Yeah, there's definitely not enough being done. The government has, it's a colonial structure, so it has a very colonial view on how these processes are to be done, and that's usually just do one, maybe two consultations with one or two nations, and then that's it. There's no follow-up. There's no connecting or reconnecting to not only just the nations, but also to the land. I'm sorry if you heard that, that's my phone. And I think that's a real gap that I would like to assume that they are trying to like bridge, but we're just not seeing it. And I think that's a real issue. I'm just trying to see, because I work for the government too, so I'm trying to say things that I'm allowed to say without not trying to not get fired. But there are many gaps, and yeah, I'm going to leave it at that, I think.
Yeah, I'd actually like to jump on this too, because again, I work in the conservation sector and we have to collaborate, especially for funding from the government on environmental projects out on the landscape. And in our territories, the problems that I see is that the government, when they come, they go to Indigenous nations with a plan already done, already laid out. And oftentimes the Indigenous nations, at least where I'm from, say these aren't the priorities. These aren't what we need right now. And, again, why didn't you consult us? And I think too, a consultation, one or two consultations is only a conversation. It is not, there's not really any actionable items that are coming out of that, but they check that box and then they roll out their conservation plans, which to me doesn't make sense. And when you confront them and you kind of talk to them head on about, adopting different methods and integrating Indigenous knowledge, especially for systemic change, they are hesitant. They are only stuck in their one way of doing Western conservation. They don't want to change. And it's frustrating not only for the Indigenous nations that can see better methods and especially for those methods to be effective on the landscape, but then also to continually come up against that barrier that we're all facing when trying to address environmental racism, and to also address even the conservation sector on trying to look at things from a different perspective and a holistic perspective, especially when it comes to implementation. But great question. Thank you so much for that. I'm going to move on to the next one. Okay, so this one is interesting. This is a good one. So how does your Indigenous worldview impact your views when working within the policy spaces that you both come from?
I can take this one first. It's really difficult in a way. I think so I work mainly within like the federal and the international level of policy, and it's giving me like a great chance to connect with Indigenous people, not only across Turtle Island, but also internationally, and to grow my Indigenous worldview with other Indigenous peoples. And that is, I know, one of the greatest privileges I have within these spaces. But it also makes my work a lot harder because I'm having to work within the colonial structures and policies that are currently in place, and having to, and this is going to sound very gross, but having to also respect those policies that are in place, because I recognize that it is a huge privilege for me to be in these rooms that I sit in, and it gives me a great chance to try to influence change. But it is having to, as they say here in politics, it's having to play the game. It's having to play this game of politics, and it goes against really a lot of my moral and ethical feelings, emotions, teachings, all that. And I would never want to give any of that up, any of what I've learned, not just from my parents and grandparents, but also from other Indigenous peoples. I would never want to give any of that up, but it does make it a lot harder to work in these spaces. But you can also make a lot of great change, knowing what you know.
Yeah, I agree with Sunshine. I think, for me, it's, as an Indigenous person, it's who I am. I can't change that, and I don't think I would want to. I wake up as a Gitxsan person, I go to bed as a Gitxsan person, and I understand that connection to community has, instilled a sense of responsibility that I want to rise to and meet rather than kind of shirk away from, especially in the climate space, and especially, working on principles and policies that will impact outcomes for my community. I think it's important. And as somebody also that's been trained as a Western scientist, like from my understanding and, all of the research I do, all of the work that I do, I can say for certain that, policies that are created with Indigenous people, with Indigenous knowledge at the forefront are stronger policies in terms of addressing climate change. I can say that without a doubt, and I strive to include that lens in all of my work because I think that's collectively how we're going to get through this. Yeah, and like I said, I think it's just important to be in these spaces, like Sunshine said, and understand that I'm just here for right now. Like really, my job is to take the work as far as I can and pass it on to the next generation too. So always remembering that. Thanks.
Thank you. So we have a few questions from the audience there, and I'd like to ask, I think, a harder question. It's a good question, though. So, do you both think that environmental racism can be adequately tackled in a fossil fuel dependent country?
No.
Yeah, that's a good question, but I think it would be very, very difficult um, to kind of reconcile the two, given that one is so, we know it's harmful. We know it's not aligned with Indigenous worldview and principles. We know that it's fueling the climate crisis, and we know that it's more affordable to switch to clean fuels. There's lots of research out there that supports that.
I'm just going to stick with no.
Okay. Okay. So another. Okay, so what about on the opposite side? So, capitalism and colonialism go hand in hand. Do you think we can transition to um, a well-being economy in Canada?
I am currently researching a lot on economics because I'm heading to COP28 to monitor Article 6, global stocktake, all that economy stuff. And if I were to give you an answer from my knowledgeable side, my very pessimistic, reading 12 hours a day policies, I would say no. But I like to be a little more optimistic than that, especially when it's late at night. And I feel like I can be a little more unhinged in these kind of panels. I think so. But it will take a lot of work. And as sad as it is to say, I don't think it will be in like my time. There's so many people working to deconstruct this system, to reform. I know that's a really gross word, but to reform the economic system and to create something more sustainable. But that is going to take a lot of work because we are deconstructing over 250 years of a system that was put in place that is working exactly how it is meant to be working. And we're still working against so many colonial policies and so many worldviews that want to keep the system in place. I do think there will be a change. And as much as I would like to think that it would be in my lifetime, I don't think so. I am pretty young though, so. But I've also seen some of the panelists, not the panelists, I've seen some of the attendees here. I know you're younger than me, but so I think you have a better chance than I do.
Would you be able to repeat the question for me, Sam? I got lost listening to Sunshine.
Yes, I can. Let me scroll back up here. Okay, so capitalism and colonialism go hand in hand. Do you think we can transition to a well-being economy in Canada?
Yeah, I think my answer will kind of echo what has already been said, is that it is hard because I think, the foundations of capitalism and the foundations of Canada were not designed as a well-being economy. It was not about what is good for people. It is not about what's good for, you know, non-human values. It's not about any of that. It was really a system that has been designed to function extractively. Our GDP in Canada is really reinforced by the extraction of our natural resources, which we know the closer you are to those extraction activities often means you'll be exposed to having lower health outcomes. It's just not a system that has really been designed for that. And I think in order to start to build that, if that's collectively where we want to go, it will also take collective change and action. I think it's something that we can definitely work towards, like Sunshine said, but not in our lifetime. I think that will take a lot of deconstruction and then reconstructing in a way that, will fit the way that we want the future to look. I think it gets really complicated when we talk about, redistributing power, especially as, governments are not built to think that way. But I think that's kind of where we're headed if this is what we want to do.
Yeah, I agree. Thank you for that. Okay, so the next question, this person also made a quote. So they said that they believe that Frederick Douglass said it best, power concedes nothing without a demand. Is policy able to generate change through addressing power?
I think, in my opinion, I think it could be, but I think the policies are then going to have to be quite a little bit more radical than what we've been seeing come out of the provincial and federal system so far. I think that a lot of these policies that have been created recently are really designed to kind of further these extractive goals that we have. Like a lot of our decisions are still based on, the foundations of wealth and economy versus considering other things that create, well-being as a whole. But yeah, I think that it's going to be a long haul, I guess. Sunshine.
Yeah, I think too, like really the definition of power now is very patriarchal focused. And that creates the issue of what we're really seeing today. Fighting over power, what is power? And if we move out of that, the patriarchal view of what power is, and move more into like a matriarchy. I'm so sorry, I cannot say that word ever, because power is not a dirty thing. It's patriarchy made it a dirty thing, and because yeah, I have a lot to say on that, but I cannot process my words properly right now. But that's a good question. Thank you.
Thank you both. Okay, so I'm gonna move on. This one was interesting. It's kind of looking at parallels between two sectors. So, this person approach to conservation has similar flaws as listening to what Indigenous groups need, but showing up and hitting a checkbox.
Can you repeat that for me one more time? I think my audio glitched a little bit.
Yes, let me find it. It moved. Give me 1 second, folks. Can you still hear me? Yes. Oh, okay. Can you still hear me? Yeah, okay, perfect. Thanks. So do you believe that the westernized approach to conservation has similar flaws as the westernized approach to medicine? An example of, not listening to what Indigenous groups need, but showing up and hitting a checkbox.
I think that it can. It depends on kind of the intent, I guess. We talk a lot about the checkbox approach. We talk a lot about engagement not always looking the way that communities would like it to. And we talk a lot about governments operating on their own timelines without considering what the community actually wants or needs. I think if conservation is approached using that kind of intent as in terms of a list that you have to kind of check off in order to approach this conservation or this idea of conservation, I think it can. But I think it really depends who's leading that process, and I think it depends how you approach these conversations. If you have somebody like we talked about already, if you have maybe an Indigenous person that's making those decisions, the process will look quite a bit different in terms of conservation value and where you see those priority areas and what you think should be done versus somebody who maybe isn't from the community, isn't from the area, doesn't understand the context or the values in that region. I think it can look a little bit different for sure.
Yeah, and to kind of just add on to that, like there are definitely a lot of checkboxes working with Indigenous communities just to have that checkbox. But I think another important view is, and I don't want to sound like I'm sympathizing with the government, but they really don't know any other way to do things. So they will continue to work the way they work because they don't know that you bring food to a community consultation, you have to feed the people. They don't know those protocols. And it is on whoever, I don't want to like say the whole government, but whoever is like running those consultations, it is on them. Like if they want to do meaningful work within a community, it's learning different protocols. And because each community has those different protocols. And I would like to think not all of it is just for a checkbox. But I think a lot of it too is just not knowing and not being ready to like actually take the initiative to learn, because it brings up being uncomfortable, especially with adults. Once you get to a certain age, apparently, I hope I never get there, but you get scared of learning. And I think grown-ups just need to be okay with not knowing something and asking questions.
I think too, in relation to this question, and especially about kind of hitting the check boxes and that person in that kind of government role, looking at this, I think too, the onus should also be on them to establish, like I know we've talked about it, establish meaningful relationships with the nations, right? So that you're learning the protocols of each nation. It's not just, oh, I'm going to learn it, I'm going to do it, but not really honor what those protocols mean to the community and honor the intention of those protocols with community, right? Because I think without that kind of integrity piece, and you're just doing the actions, that alone is a checkbox. And that doesn't feel, authentic, I think, to Indigenous communities, um, you know, trying to build bridges and work within, as you both have mentioned, systems that really aren't designed for us. Okay. All right. Okay, so this one's a good question. It's a little outside the um um okay. So this person asks, how much time do you both spend on the land, water, and in ceremony with recognized elders in order to find balance in your work and within the uh important space in standing up for Mother Earth and in turn the people, the animals, and then that we're all connected?
I think for me, this is an easy one. It's just as much as I absolutely can. It's really hard not living in my community, but it's really nice to be able to take the time when I have it to go back and participate in all of these ways. But I'm also really lucky where I work. I work at the Canadian Climate Institute, and they are really doing a lot of really cool things with kind of recognizing that people have different needs and different lived experiences. My boss is also Indigenous, and there's a lot of recognition for taking time for ceremony or being able to balance my time in order to accommodate being able to go out on the land more. And also with the understanding that those activities actually will help to make me a better employee and a better researcher. As an Indigenous person working in policy and research to me really is ceremony. It's something that I can take home and feed my community with. And, with that acknowledgement, I think, yeah, it's as much as I possibly can.
I'm so sorry. This is going to be very unhinged. I really understand the concept behind this question, but I think it can also be very damaging for Indigenous folks who didn't grow up in ceremony, who don't have elders in their lives, or who have been like heavily affected by colonialism and residential school. This is going to get a little personal very quickly. So I grew up in the US in a city. I moved from there to the res, and I don't fully understand when people say they feel a connection to the land. I can understand it, and I do feel it when I'm in the water, but I just cannot conceptualize what people say when they feel connected to the land, because I never grew up with that. And I personally also have a lot of issues with elders because I'm scared of them because of what I've gone through with elders. And so I think in a way too, like as good intended as this question is, it can be very pan-indigenizing, to all Indigenous people are connected to land, all Indigenous people are connected to elders. And I think we all find connection in different ways. And this is going to sound very gross, I know, but mine is through policy. I found how I can help and how I can create change is through texts and language. And that's my way of connecting. And yeah, I understand the intent behind the question, but I also think that it just needs to be acknowledged that there is a lot of trauma with things like land, water, ceremony, and elders.
Thank you, Sunshine, for being, really authentic in the way that you show up and are able to, answer the question in a, in genuine way. And I'm recognizing, a bit of the emotional labor that you had to go through to answer that. So I want to say thank you for that and recognize that. And just gently remind the audience, I'm kind of sifting through the questions, figuring out which are the most appropriate, but as audience members, to do that labor while we're holding space for Indigenous voices in this webinar, to be mindful of what are the impacts of the questions you're asking as audience members to these, really well-educated, well-spoken folks, right? They're taking the time to learn from you're taking the time to learn from them. So just be mindful of again, those impacts of what you're asking. I'm filtering it right now, but for further learning for our audience. Thank you. Okay, so let's see. We have a few minutes left. So just taking a look here. Well, let me do a check-in here. Jana and Sunshine, how are you feeling? I know we've thrown a lot of questions at you, but is there anything that you really wanted to highlight with this platform that you wanted to elaborate more on, even a project within your work? Again, another topic that we haven't quite addressed yet that you really wanted to dig into. I'm going to open the floor up to you.
I'm just finding my work Instagram. I'm on the climate justice team. So I'm going to go get our handle to put into the chat that you can all go follow.
I think for what I would like to highlight is, at the Institute, like I said, this is my own views, but we're doing some really cool work at my day job right now. We are working in partnership with Indigenous Clean Energy on a project that communities have been really calling for decades, which is looking at the intersection between Indigenous community health, Indigenous community housing, and clean energy and energy retrofits, and how they all connect and really kind of feed off of one another. We're going to be publishing a commentary review, I think in June, depending on how things go. We're currently doing engagement right now, but this is a really good example of Indigenous-led research and also looking at, a little bit of a different lens on climate change research and what communities are really hoping to see and what they want to be researched, or what parts of the research they want to lead as well. So I that's what I do during the day, and I really enjoy it. And if you want to check it out, that's coming soon.
So I'm just going to put into the chat so I'm on the climate justice team
Thank you
with
both
Idea.
for that.
Oh, sorry. The Okay, I'm on the climate justice team with Idea, and we work in, I believe, 5 different communities right now within BC and Alberta. And the projects run from food sovereignty, oceans. I'm trying to remember everything: cultural revitalization, language revitalization. My focus is on policy, and it's just really connecting with communities, because these are community-led projects, and finding safe ways to talk to youth and community members on what the climate crisis is and how it's affecting us and how to process these emotions. Yeah, so I put our Instagram into the chat. So go follow. We do some cool work.
Thank you for both of those. Okay, so I'm gonna reach out to the audience. Is there any last questions from our live audience in the room? Is there any last questions that I can ask that haven't been sent over? That no questions. Okay. Okay, all of them have been sent over. Okay. So let's see here. Well, I can read a comment. So one folk, they wanted to highlight a course on nativeland.com. It focuses on Indigenous justice. It's a program designed for anyone to become familiar with the laws of both from a colonial point of view and an Indigenous point of view. And she said that it's free and online. So there's that. I'm just scrolling here. Some folks have asked how they can access the recording. I'm sure that we will address that closer to the end. I'm just looking for questions for our panelists here. Okay, so I'm going to move on to our call to action. So, okay, so I have one question. This is from Dais. So, speakers. Okay, so you have an active audience here of people interested in this topic. Can you please spend 3 minutes sharing your thoughts on how they can get involved in advocacy to shape the policies that impact the issues of environmental racism, which organizations to be aware of, and which resources to access?
This is a loaded question. Wow. I think for like the biggest thing is really to start doing your own unlearning and learning. Environmental racism is more than just, it affects more than just Indigenous peoples. I know this is Indigenous focused, but if we're going to talk about environmental racism, it's a lot of learning and unlearning. For resources, there are a handful of Indigenous organizations that work on decolonizing policy, like specifically policy speaking. The organization I work with, Videa, we have a decolonization toolkit. Ooh, my name. Indigenous Climate Action does some really cool things. I want to say another name, but I will let Jana say it because I know she works specifically with them, so I will not say it. But there are, and I guess UN speaking too, because I work with the UN and international sector, is if you were to look up, I always get the name wrong, the International Indigenous Forum on climate change, IIYFCC. They are the UN Forum for Indigenous Peoples, and they put out reports on specifically UN climate policies that are being negotiated and just how those policies can uphold Indigenous rights. I don't think that was 3 minutes, but I cannot think of anything else.
No, that's great. If that's where you land on things, thank you so much for that.
Yeah, I can jump in as well. I think in terms of organizations to be aware of, I think the Yellowhead Institute is, of course, a great organization that really focuses a lot on Indigenous-led research and policy. I had the pleasure of working with them on my recent publication, which was Bad Forecast. It published a couple of months ago, looking at kind of Indigenous inclusion and representation within the development of the National Adaptation Strategy specifically. And I always really look forward to reading what they come out with in their publications. Another organization, of course, I have to say it, is the Climate Institute. I work there. It's a Western organization, but recently we do have our new Indigenous Research and Partnership stream, which, like I mentioned, is currently developing a commentary review, which focuses on the intersection of clean energy, housing, and community health. We also run our Indigenous Perspectives case study program, which amplifies Indigenous-led climate research. So I published with them in 2022, and we just closed today, actually, our call for 2024 proposals for this research program. So look forward to that as well. And, you know, as I mentioned, mentorship and creating space, I think a little bit earlier, a good organization to be aware of is also Indigenous Clean Energy, which I think is what Sunshine was thinking of earlier. They run a whole host of programs, so everything from bringing it home, where communities are really able to build clean energy projects in their own community in their own way, to Generation Power, which is actually where I met Sunshine, which is a youth by youth for youth program, and they do a really great job in kind of creating programming to build, you know, confidence and capacity in Indigenous youth. A lot of former ICE alumni are up to really cool things, and I suggest, yeah, definitely check them out too. I think in terms of like resources to access, a good place to start would be publications by those organizations, and, you know, also just really making sure you make an effort to, yeah, learn and unlearn your bias. But also when you're doing a lot of this work, really look for indigenous authors. I think there's no shortage of skill in our people, and I think having that at the forefront of research projects will really help to shift those narratives that we talked about earlier. If you want to know more specifically about environmental racism, some of the resources that I really liked were, there was a resource by the David Suzuki Foundation that I found helpful, and I can link it in the chat. And there was also another one by the National Collaborating Center for Environmental Health. I think also the Climate Institute published a piece on environmental racism in 2021, and I can also link those if you're interested.
Thank you, Jana. Well, thank you both for passing on, you know, your handles and then those resources for the audience to dig into. I don't believe we have any more questions to ask of you both. I realize that this was a heavy Q&A period, but I can't thank you enough for taking the time to answer from a good place and just saying and what we're tackling kind of when we look at policy and environmental racism. So I really appreciate that. And I see you linking the resources, Jana. Thank you so much. So folks, if you would like to look to the chat, Kamara is translating so that you can have access to those resources. I encourage everybody to take a look at them, to dig in more to those learnings. I am going to probably pass this back to Rahel. And I just want to again say thank you so much to you both for taking the time to answer these questions and be with us today.
Thank you so much. Let's give them a hand, everybody online. Okay. Samantha, thank you so much for moderating. Jana and Sunshine, thank you so much for being here and taking the time to answer questions and also share your knowledge and your insight. We appreciate it so much. So this is not only the wrap up of our session, but this is also the wrap up of our anti-racism series. Can we get a hand clap for that? Okay. All right, so as you know, this is just one of the many events that we host here at the Dais. We always have new and exciting projects, fellowships, and events coming up. So if you are not already a part of the Dais community and you're not in our newsletter, please go to dais.ca, join our newsletter, get updates about any upcoming events, fellowships, courses, and so forth. Julian, can you go to the next slide for me? Okay, so before you go, I would like everyone to know about an opportunity to support some of the work that we'll be doing. We have Generation Climate Policy Fellowship coming up, and it's focusing on young adults from Black, Indigenous, and racialized communities. They can become fellows as a part of this program, and they also get to build their knowledge on a lot of the things that both Jana and Sunshine spoke about today, which is public policy, change making, and then they also get matched with a mentor to be able to do this work in their local community based on a project that they would like to do. And so if you are interested, or if you are someone who'd like to support this work and partner, please contact Kamara Chambers, who is our Director of Leadership Development here at the Dais. All right, next slide, please. Okay, so there was a question online I actually want to address. Someone was asking about recordings. I believe everyone who's here in person and online have registered through the Eventbrite. We do send a follow-up email with some of the resources that were shared as well as the recording. So you should be able to get that in a few days. All right, we do have a networking session for those in person where we have a few questions from today's session. So you're welcome to stick around, finish the food, please, and thank you. And for those online, thank you so much for joining us. And once again, Sunshine, Jana, Sam, thank you. And Jillian, thanks for your online support as well. Take care, everyone. Yeah.